Hello, I am Socrates. Today, let us walk together through the streets of Athens and observe the world.
Every day, I meet people, listen to their words, and learn something new.
Sometimes just observing a face, a gesture, or a silence can tell us more than 1,000 words.
Learning isn't just about listening to words, but observing, reflecting, and understanding what surrounds us.
Welcome, relax, and let me guide you on a journey through the dusty streets of ancient Athens, where a man with simple questions would change the course of human thought forever. Breathe deeply, close your eyes if you wish, and immerse yourself with me in a distant era, when philosophy was born among marble columns and conversations in the marketplace. This is the story of Socrates, a man who never wrote a single word, yet whose ideas still resonate today, 2,500 years after his death. Imagine walking through the streets of Athens on a warm morning in the 5th century before Christ. The Mediterranean sun illuminates the white temples towering over the Acropolis, while in the streets below, the city teems with life. Merchants cry out their wares, artisans work in their workshops, and among the crowd, a peculiar-looking man walks barefoot, stopping from time to time to converse with anyone willing to listen. This man is Socrates, and though he may not seem particularly impressive at first glance, he is about to transform the way humanity thinks, reasons, and understands itself. The story of Socrates is wrapped in mystery and fascination, because everything we know about him comes from the words of others. He himself never wrote anything, preferring to live philosophy rather than document it. Yet, through the writings of his students, particularly Plato and Xenophon, we can reconstruct the image of an extraordinary man who dedicated his life to the pursuit of truth and wisdom. A man who deeply believed that the unexamined life was not worth living, and who demonstrated this conviction until his last breath. As the evening wind blows through the columns of the Parthenon, and shadows lengthen across the stone streets, allow me to tell you the story of this remarkable man. A story of intellectual courage, unwavering integrity, and a love of wisdom that would inspire generations of thinkers. It is a story that begins humbly, with the birth of a child in a family of craftsmen, and ends with one of the most courageous acts in human history: the choice to die rather than compromise one's principles. The Golden Age of Athens, a world in transformation. Socrates was born around 470 years before the Common Era, in an Athens that was entering its golden age. It was an extraordinary time to be alive in the Greek city-state. Athens had recently defeated the Persian Empire in the Persian Wars, and under the leadership of Pericles, the city was experiencing an explosion of artistic, architectural, and intellectual creativity without precedent. The Parthenon was being built. Tragedies by Aeschylus and Sophocles were being performed in amphitheaters, and democracy was flourishing in a way the world had never seen before. Into this vibrant, dynamic world, Socrates was born. His father, Sophroniscus, was a stonemason and sculptor, a craftsman who worked with his hands to shape marble and stone. His mother, Narrator, was a midwife, helping bring new life into the world. These humble origins would shape Socrates in profound ways. From his father, he likely learned the value of careful, precise work, the patience required to chip away at stone to reveal the form within. From his mother, he would later draw one of his most famous metaphors, comparing his philosophical method to midwifery, helping others give birth to ideas rather than implanting them. The neighborhood where Socrates grew up was called Allopete, a deme or district of Athens. As a boy, he would have received a basic education, learning to read and write, studying Homer and the poets, learning music and gymnastics, as was customary for Athenian boys of his station. But Socrates was not born into the aristocracy. His family was respectable but not wealthy, and this middle-class background meant that while he received an education, he was also expected to learn a trade and contribute to the household economy. Young Socrates would have walked the same streets of Athens that he would later make famous through his philosophical conversations. He would have seen the great statesmen and generals who led Athens to glory. He would have witnessed the construction of the magnificent temples and public buildings that made Athens the jewel of the ancient world. And perhaps, even as a young boy, he was already asking questions, already curious about the world around him and the nature of things. The Athens of Socrates' youth was a city of contrasts and contradictions. It was the birthplace of democracy, where citizens gathered in the assembly to debate and vote on matters of state. Yet, it was also a society built on slavery, where women had few rights, and where only adult male citizens could participate in political life. It was a culture that valued beauty, symmetry, and proportion in art and architecture. Yet the gods they worshipped were often portrayed as petty, jealous, and capricious. These contradictions would later become subjects of Socrates' philosophical investigations. As Socrates grew into a young man, he likely followed his father into the stonemason's trade, learning to work with hammer and chisel, to cut and shape stone for buildings and sculptures. Some ancient sources suggest he worked as a sculptor for many years before devoting himself entirely to philosophy. Whether or not this is true, the metaphor is apt. Just as a sculptor chips away at marble to reveal the form hidden within, Socrates would later chip away at people's assumptions and beliefs to reveal the truth hidden beneath. But the young Socrates was not content simply to learn a trade and live a conventional life. Something stirred within him, a curiosity about fundamental questions that practical skills could not satisfy. Why do people behave as they do? What is justice? What is courage? What makes a life worth living? These questions, which most people never pause to consider deeply, began to occupy Socrates' thoughts more and more. The physical appearance of Socrates was, by all accounts, quite unusual and not conventionally attractive by Greek standards. In a culture that celebrated male beauty and physical perfection, as seen in their sculptures and athletic competitions, Socrates stood out for all the wrong reasons. He was short and stocky, with a potbelly that suggested he enjoyed good food and wine. His eyes bulged from his head, a condition known as exophthalmia, and they didn't focus straight ahead but seemed to look sideways. He had a snub nose that was often compared to that of a pig or a satyr, those mythological creatures that were half man, half beast. Yet Plato, his most famous student, would later write that those who knew Socrates well saw beyond this unprepossessing exterior to perceive a different kind of beauty. The beauty of his mind, the brilliance of his arguments, the depth of his wisdom, and the integrity of his character shone through in a way that physical handsomeness could never match. Socrates himself seemed entirely unconcerned with his appearance. He often wore the same simple cloak day and night, went barefoot even in winter, and rarely bathed or groomed himself carefully. This indifference to physical appearance and material comfort would become a hallmark of Socrates' philosophy and way of life. He believed that the body was merely the vessel for the soul, and that caring for one's soul, developing virtue and wisdom, was infinitely more important than adorning one's body or accumulating possessions. This wasn't an abstract philosophical position for Socrates. It was how he actually lived. Throughout his life, he remained poor, often going hungry, wearing threadbare clothes, yet he was, by most accounts, remarkably happy and content. As a young man, Socrates would have been expected to perform his civic duties, and one of the most important of these was military service. Athens was frequently at war during this period, and all male citizens were required to serve in the army. Socrates served with distinction as a hoplite, a heavily armed infantry soldier who fought in the tight formations called phalanxes. Despite his unusual appearance and philosophical disposition, Socrates proved to be an excellent soldier, known for his physical endurance, courage under fire, and calm demeanor in the face of danger. He fought in several important battles during the Peloponnesian War, that long and devastating conflict between Athens and Sparta that would eventually lead to Athens' downfall. At the Battle of Potidaea in 432 BCE, Socrates not only fought bravely, but also saved the life of a young Athenian aristocrat named Alcibiades, who would later become one of his most famous and controversial students. According to Alcibiades' own account, when he was wounded and surrounded by enemies, Socrates stood over him and fought off the attackers, ensuring they both escaped to safety. At the Battle of Delium in 424 BCE, when the Athenian army was routed and forced to retreat, Socrates maintained his composure and discipline. While others fled in panic, he withdrew slowly and calmly, always ready to turn and fight if pursued. His fellow soldier Laches, who was a general, later praised Socrates, saying that if all Athenians had fought as bravely as Socrates, they would never have been defeated. This physical courage and mental fortitude in battle would later be matched by his moral courage in facing death. The ability to endure physical hardship was legendary among those who knew Socrates. At Potidaea, the army spent the winter besieging the city, and the soldiers suffered terribly from the cold. While others huddled in their tents, wrapped in multiple cloaks, Socrates walked about in his usual single garment and bare feet, seemingly unaffected by the freezing temperatures. His fellow soldiers marveled at this, though some resented what they saw as showing off. But this remarkable physical endurance was not an end in itself for Socrates. It was part of his broader philosophy of self-mastery and control. He believed that reason should govern the passions, that a person should not be enslaved to physical desires or fears. Whether it was hunger, cold, fatigue, or even the fear of death, Socrates demonstrated throughout his life an ability to rise above these bodily concerns through the power of his mind and will. The Oracle's Proclamation, the beginning of philosophy. The turning point in Socrates' life came when he was middle-aged, probably in his late 30s or early 40s. His friend, Chaerephon, a loyal companion from youth, traveled to the oracle at Delphi with a question. The oracle at Delphi was one of the most sacred sites in ancient Greece, where the priestess of Apollo, known as the Pythia, would enter a trance and deliver prophecies and answers to questions posed by pilgrims. Greeks from all over the Mediterranean world consulted the oracle on matters great and small, from whether to go to war to whom to marry. Chaerephon, who knew Socrates well and admired him greatly, asked the oracle a simple question. Is there anyone wiser than Socrates? The oracle's response was unequivocal. No one is wiser than Socrates. When Chaerephon returned to Athens and told Socrates what the oracle had said, the philosopher was bewildered and disturbed. How could this be true? Socrates was acutely aware of how little he actually knew. He had no special expertise in any field. He wasn't a skilled craftsman like some, or a learned teacher like others. He certainly didn't feel wise. But Socrates took the oracle's pronouncement seriously. The oracle of Apollo was considered divinely inspired, and to dismiss or ignore its message would be impious. So Socrates decided to investigate. He would seek out people who were widely regarded as wise and question them to see if they were indeed wiser than he. Perhaps the oracle's message had been misunderstood, or perhaps these supposedly wise people would prove to be truly knowledgeable, demonstrating that he, Socrates, was not the wisest after all. Socrates began his investigation by approaching politicians, men who held positions of power in Athens and were respected for their judgment and decision-making abilities. He engaged them in conversation, asking them questions about justice, virtue, and governance. What he discovered dismayed and astonished him. These politicians spoke confidently and at length, but when Socrates pressed them with careful questions, it became clear that their understanding was shallow. They had opinions and convictions, but they couldn't explain or defend them rationally. They thought they knew what justice was, but they couldn't define it. They believed they understood virtue, but their explanations were full of contradictions. What troubled Socrates most was not that these men didn't know, it was that they didn't know that they didn't know. They were confident in their wisdom, but that confidence was built on sand. When Socrates pointed out the inconsistencies and gaps in their reasoning, some became angry and defensive. They felt he was trying to make them look foolish, and in a sense he was, though his intention was not malicious. He simply wanted to understand the truth. Next, Socrates turned to the poets, men who were revered in Greek culture for their beautiful verses and profound insights into human nature. Surely they must possess genuine wisdom. But again, Socrates was disappointed. The poets could create works of great beauty and emotional power, works that moved audiences to tears or laughter. But when Socrates asked them to explain what their poetry meant, to articulate the wisdom it contained, they couldn't do so satisfactorily. It seemed that poets created by inspiration or divine gift, not through understanding. They couldn't explain their own creations. Finally, Socrates approached the craftsmen, the skilled workers who made everything from shoes to ships, from pottery to sculptures. Here, at least, he found genuine knowledge. A craftsman knew his craft. A shoemaker understood how to make shoes, what materials to use, what techniques to employ. This was real, demonstrable knowledge. But Socrates noticed something troubling. Because the craftsmen knew their particular crafts so well, they assumed they were also wise about other matters, about justice and governance and the nature of the good life. Their expertise in one narrow domain led them to overestimate their understanding of everything else. Through these investigations, Socrates came to understand what the oracle had meant. He was the wisest, not because he knew more than others, but because he alone knew that he didn't know. The politicians, poets, and craftsmen all labored under the delusion that they understood things they actually didn't understand. They were ignorant, but worse, they were ignorant of their ignorance. Socrates, by contrast, was aware of the limits of his knowledge. He knew what he didn't know, and this recognition was itself a kind of wisdom, the beginning of wisdom. This realization transformed Socrates' life and gave him a mission. If he was indeed the wisest, and if wisdom was the most valuable thing a person could possess, then he had a duty to share this insight with others. He began to see himself as a kind of gadfly, as he would later describe it during his trial. Athens was like a large, noble horse that had grown sluggish and lazy, and he was the gadfly sent by the gods to sting it into wakefulness, to make the Athenians examine their lives and beliefs critically. From this point forward, Socrates dedicated himself entirely to philosophy. He spent his days in the agora, the marketplace and public square of Athens, engaging anyone who would talk with him in philosophical conversation. He questioned everyone, young and old, rich and poor, citizens and foreigners, men and occasionally women, though this was rare in Athens. He asked them about virtue, justice, courage, piety, friendship, love, beauty, and knowledge itself. And through his questioning, he revealed how little people truly understood about the things they claimed to know and value most. The method Socrates developed for these investigations became known as the Socratic method, or Socratic dialogue, and it revolutionized philosophy and education. It would influence thinking for the next 2.5 millennia and continues to be used in classrooms and legal settings today. Understanding this method is crucial to understanding Socrates and his impact on Western thought. The Socratic method. Philosophy as dialogue. The Socratic method was deceptively simple in structure, but profound in its effects. Socrates would begin by claiming ignorance, genuinely expressing his desire to learn about some topic. He would then ask someone who claimed to know about that topic to explain it to him. The person would offer a definition or explanation, feeling confident in their understanding. Then Socrates would begin asking questions. These questions were not random or designed merely to confuse. They were carefully crafted to test the consistency and coherence of the person's claims. Socrates would take what the person said and explore its implications. He would ask for clarification, for examples, for exceptions. He would point out how one claim seemed to contradict another. Through this process of questioning, called elenchus or cross-examination, contradictions and inconsistencies would emerge, and the person's initial confident understanding would begin to unravel. Let's imagine a typical Socratic dialogue. Suppose Socrates encounters a young man who claims to understand courage, perhaps a soldier returning from battle. Socrates might say, "You seem to be a courageous person, and you've seen courage in battle. I've often wondered what courage really is. Could you help me understand?" The young man, flattered and confident, might reply, "Courage is standing your ground in battle and not running away." Socrates would nod thoughtfully, then ask, "So courage is always about standing your ground and never retreating?" "Yes, that's right," the young man might say. "But what about a strategic retreat? Socrates would continue. If a general withdraws his forces to avoid a larger defeat or to lure the enemy into a trap, is that not also courageous? Yet the soldiers are retreating, not standing their ground. The young man would pause, recognizing the problem. Well, perhaps courage is knowing when to advance and when to retreat, doing what's best for victory. Ah, Socrates would say, so courage involves wisdom, knowing what's truly best? Yes, I suppose it does. Then is courage the same as wisdom? Or is it something different? And if it requires wisdom, can someone be courageous without being wise? Can a person be both courageous and foolish? And so the conversation would continue, with each answer raising new questions, each attempt at definition revealing new problems. Eventually, the young man would likely admit, perhaps with some frustration, that he doesn't actually understand courage as well as he thought he did. He's reached a state called aporia, a kind of puzzlement or being at a loss. This, for Socrates, was not failure but the first step toward genuine wisdom. Socrates compared his method to his mother's profession of midwifery. Just as a midwife helps a woman give birth but doesn't create the baby herself, Socrates helped people give birth to ideas but didn't implant those ideas. The knowledge was already within the person, waiting to be discovered through careful questioning and reflection. This was a radically different approach from traditional teaching, where a teacher simply tells students what they should know. The beauty of the Socratic method was that it made learning active rather than passive. The person being questioned had to think deeply, to examine their own beliefs, to defend their positions, to recognize contradictions. This was much more effective than simply being told what to think. When someone discovered truth through their own reasoning, guided by Socratic questions, that understanding was deeper and more lasting than knowledge received passively. But the Socratic method had another purpose beyond just testing definitions and exposing ignorance. Socrates believed that self-examination was the most important activity a person could engage in. The famous Delphic maxim, "Know thyself," was central to his philosophy. By questioning others and being questioned in return, people came to understand themselves better, their beliefs, their values, their assumptions, their ignorance. This self-knowledge was, for Socrates, the foundation of virtue and the good life. Socrates also believed that virtue and knowledge were intimately connected. He held that no one does wrong willingly. People do wrong things because they don't truly know what's good. If someone really understood that an action was bad for them, genuinely bad for their soul and their well-being, they wouldn't do it. Wrongdoing stems from ignorance. Therefore, the path to virtue is through knowledge, and the path to knowledge is through the examined life, constantly questioning and refining one's understanding. This connection between knowledge and virtue had profound implications. It meant that virtue could be taught, or at least cultivated, through philosophical inquiry. It meant that becoming a better person was primarily an intellectual task, requiring thought and reflection rather than just willpower or habit. It also meant that Socrates saw his philosophical mission as fundamentally moral. By making people examine their lives, he was helping them become better people, helping them care for their souls. The young men of Athens were fascinated by Socrates and his method. They would follow him around the agora, watching him question their elders and supposed betters, seeing respected politicians and teachers reduced to confusion and aporia. For young people, especially those from wealthy families who didn't need to work for a living, this was exciting and entertaining. Socrates became something of a celebrity, gathering a following of devoted students who wanted to learn his method and engage in philosophical discussion. Among these young followers were some who would become famous in their own right. There was Plato, who would become Socrates' most important student, preserving his teacher's method and ideas in a series of brilliant philosophical dialogues that remain central to Western philosophy. There was Xenophon, a soldier and historian who also wrote accounts of Socrates' teachings. There was Antisthenes, who would found the Cynic school of philosophy. There was Aristippus, who founded the Cyrenaic school. And there were others, each of whom took something different from Socrates' teachings and developed it in their own direction. The diversity of philosophical schools that emerged from Socrates' students is remarkable. The Cynics emphasized self-sufficiency and rejection of conventional values. The Cyrenaics focused on pleasure and happiness. The Stoics, influenced by Socrates through Xenophon, emphasized virtue as the only true good. And Plato's Academy became the center of Western philosophical thought for centuries. This diversity suggests that Socrates' influence was more about method and attitude than about specific doctrines. He taught people how to think, not what to think. But not everyone appreciated Socrates' method or his influence on the youth. Many Athenians, particularly those he had questioned and embarrassed publicly, resented him deeply. They saw him as an arrogant sophist who made young people disrespectful of tradition and authority. They blamed him for the corruption of youth, for making them question everything, for undermining the values and beliefs that held Athenian society together. Daily life. The barefoot philosopher. Despite his growing fame and influence, Socrates lived a remarkably simple life. He owned very little, wore simple clothes, often went barefoot, and had no regular source of income. Unlike the sophists, those professional teachers who charged fees for their instruction, Socrates refused to accept payment for his philosophical conversations. He insisted that wisdom couldn't be bought and sold like a commodity. This principle meant that he lived in poverty, depending on the hospitality of friends and admirers for meals and necessities. His typical day began early, as was common in ancient Athens. He would rise with the sun and make his way to the agora, the marketplace that served as the commercial and social center of Athens. Here, among the stalls selling olives and olive oil, wine and grain, pottery and cloth, Socrates would find people to talk with. Sometimes he would engage with shopkeepers and craftsmen, asking them about their work. Other times he would encounter fellow citizens and engage them in philosophical discussion. And often, his young followers would gather around him, listening to his conversations and participating in the discussions. The physical setting of these conversations is important to imagine. The Athenian agora was a large open space surrounded by colonnaded buildings called stoas, which provided shade from the hot Mediterranean sun. People would gather in these shaded areas to conduct business, exchange news, and socialize. It was a vibrant, noisy place, with vendors calling out, animals being traded, legal disputes being argued. In the midst of this bustle, Socrates would stand or sit, often surrounded by a small crowd, engaged in intense philosophical discussion. Picture Socrates in conversation. A short, stocky man with bulging eyes and a snub nose, bare feet planted firmly on the stone pavement, his simple cloak hanging loosely from his shoulders. He might lean on a staff, or gesture with his hands as he spoke. His voice would be clear and penetrating, with a slight ironic tone when he claimed ignorance or praised his interlocutor's wisdom. Those who knew him well could recognize when he was being genuine and when he was being subtly sarcastic. What made Socrates particularly memorable was his absolute absorption in philosophical conversation. When engaged in dialogue, he seemed to forget everything else: hunger, thirst, cold, heat, time passing. There are accounts of him standing in one spot for hours, lost in thought, oblivious to everything around him. Once, according to Plato's account in the Symposium, while on military campaign, Socrates stood thinking in the same spot from dawn one day until dawn the next, a full 24 hours, while his fellow soldiers watched in amazement. This ability to focus intensely was combined with remarkable physical endurance. While others at a drinking party would become drunk and incapacitated, Socrates could drink large quantities of wine without apparent effect, remaining clear-headed and sharp in argument. While others suffered from cold or heat, hunger or thirst, Socrates seemed largely unaffected by physical discomfort. This wasn't asceticism for its own sake. Socrates enjoyed good food and wine when available, but he had trained himself not to need such things, not to be enslaved to bodily desires. His appearance and behavior made him unmistakable in Athens. People would point him out to visitors. There goes Socrates, the philosopher. He became such a familiar figure that the comic playwrights put him in their plays, usually as a ridiculous character. The most famous of these was Aristophanes' play The Clouds, performed in 423 BCE, which portrayed Socrates as the head of a thinking school where students learned to make the worse argument appear the better through clever rhetoric, and where silly pseudo-scientific theories about the clouds being gods were taught. This caricature was unfair in many ways. Socrates wasn't interested in natural philosophy or scientific speculation about the physical world, as the play suggested. He focused on ethical questions and human affairs. And he certainly didn't teach rhetoric for money like the sophists. But the play reveals how Socrates was perceived by at least some Athenians as a dangerous intellectual who confused people with clever arguments and corrupted traditional values. Socrates' home life was, by all accounts, less pleasant than his public philosophical life. He married a woman named Xanthippe, who was considerably younger than he. They had 3 sons together, Lamprocles, Sophroniscus, and Menexenus. Xanthippe has come down through history as a quarrelsome, nagging wife, though whether this reputation is fair is unclear. The ancient sources that describe her this way were written by men who may have been biased, and we have no account from Xanthippe herself. What seems clear is that Xanthippe had reason to be frustrated. Socrates spent his days philosophizing rather than earning money, leaving the family in poverty. He showed more interest in educating other people's sons than in caring for his own. When asked how he could endure living with such a difficult woman, Socrates reportedly replied that just as those who want to become excellent horsemen choose the most spirited horses to train, he had chosen to live with Xanthippe so he could learn to get along with all people, even the most difficult. This response, whether or not it's authentic, reveals something about Socrates' character and philosophy. Everything was an opportunity for learning and self-improvement. Even domestic difficulties could be viewed as training in patience and endurance. This perspective, this ability to find philosophical value in everyday experiences, was characteristic of Socrates' approach to life. Socrates' relationship with his sons seems to have been distant. Ancient sources report that they were rather mediocre individuals, lacking their father's brilliance and virtue. Socrates himself said he had little to do with their upbringing. This might seem hypocritical from someone who was accused of corrupting other people's sons, but it reflects Socrates' genuine belief that his philosophical mission was more important than family obligations. He felt called by the gods to be a gadfly to Athens, and everything else was secondary to that divine mission. The poverty in which Socrates lived was a constant theme in accounts of his life. He owned essentially nothing beyond his simple cloak and perhaps a staff. He borrowed money from friends and never repaid it. He accepted invitations to dinner parties at the homes of wealthy Athenians, providing entertainment and intellectual stimulation in exchange for a meal. Some saw this as noble rejection of materialism. Others saw it as freeloading. But for Socrates, poverty was not a burden, but a liberation. Without possessions to worry about, without a business to run or property to maintain, he was free to devote himself entirely to philosophy. This lifestyle also gave Socrates moral authority. When he argued that virtue and wisdom were more valuable than wealth, and that people should care for their souls rather than their bodies and possessions, he could point to his own life as proof of his sincerity. He wasn't asking others to live in a way he himself was unwilling to live. His poverty demonstrated that he genuinely believed his own teachings. The Examined Life, Core Philosophy. At the heart of Socrates' philosophy was a simple but profound idea. The unexamined life is not worth living. This statement, which he would make during his trial, encapsulates his entire philosophical project. For Socrates, living as a human being meant more than just existing, eating, sleeping, working, and reproducing. It meant using the capacity for reason that distinguishes humans from animals. It meant reflecting on one's beliefs, values, and actions, questioning whether they are justified and true. To understand why Socrates placed such emphasis on self-examination, we need to understand his view of the soul and virtue. For Socrates, the soul or psyche was the essence of a person, the seat of reason and moral character. The body was merely the temporary vessel for the soul, and bodily needs and pleasures, while not evil in themselves, were far less important than the health and well-being of the soul. When Socrates talked about caring for oneself, he meant caring for one's soul through the cultivation of virtue and wisdom. But what did Socrates mean by virtue? The Greek word he used was arete, which can also be translated as excellence. Just as a knife's virtue or excellence is its sharpness, its ability to cut well, a person's virtue is their excellence as a human being. And for Socrates, human excellence consisted primarily in wisdom, justice, courage, temperance or self-control, and piety or reverence for the divine. These virtues were not separate qualities but aspects of a unified whole, all based on knowledge and understanding. Socrates believed that virtue and knowledge were inseparable. To truly know what justice is, for instance, is to be just. No one who genuinely understands that an action is unjust will choose to do it, because they would understand that injustice harms their soul, which is their truest self. This might seem counterintuitive. Don't people often do things they know are wrong? But Socrates would argue that in such cases, the person doesn't really know that what they're doing is wrong. They may believe it intellectually, but they don't truly understand it in their soul. True knowledge inevitably leads to virtuous action. This identification of virtue with knowledge had revolutionary implications. It meant that to become a better person, one needed education and philosophical inquiry, not just habit or religious ritual. It meant that moral improvement was possible through reason and dialogue. And it meant that Socrates' philosophical mission of questioning people and making them examine their beliefs was not just an intellectual exercise, but a deeply moral activity. By helping people understand themselves and the nature of virtue, he was helping them become better people. The Delphic maxim, "Know thyself," was central to Socrates' philosophy. This ancient inscription at the Temple of Apollo at Delphi was more than a suggestion. For Socrates, it was a moral imperative. To know oneself meant to understand one's own ignorance, to recognize the limits of one's knowledge. It meant to examine one's beliefs and values critically, not accepting them blindly just because they were traditional or commonly held. It meant understanding what one truly is, a soul that will outlast the body, whose true well-being depends on virtue rather than wealth or pleasure. Self-knowledge also meant understanding one's daimonion, a term Socrates used to describe an inner voice or divine sign that guided him. This daimonion was not like the conventional gods of Greek religion. It didn't give positive commands or instructions. Instead, according to Socrates, it would intervene to warn him when he was about to do something wrong, saying simply, "No." He experienced this voice throughout his life, starting from childhood, and he trusted it completely. In some ways, we might think of it as an early description of conscience, though Socrates believed it was genuinely divine in origin. This inner voice, this daimonion, would become one of the charges against Socrates at his trial. His accusers claimed he was introducing new gods, referring to this strange divine sign he talked about. For Athenians who believed in the traditional pantheon of gods like Zeus, Athena, and Apollo, Socrates' talk of a personal divine voice seemed impious and potentially dangerous. It suggested that he had direct access to the divine without need for priests or traditional religious observance. But Socrates saw no contradiction between his daimonion and proper reverence for the gods. He believed that the gods were perfectly good and wise, and that they cared about human virtue. The traditional myths that depicted the gods as jealous, petty, and immoral were, in Socrates' view, false stories that shouldn't be believed. The true gods wouldn't behave that way. This rationalization of religion, this insistence on questioning even traditional stories about the gods, was another aspect of Socrates' philosophy that made him controversial. Another key aspect of Socrates' ethics was his belief that it is better to suffer injustice than to commit it. This might seem obvious in a way, but its full implications are radical. If someone wrongs you, Socrates argued, they harm themselves more than they harm you. They corrupt their own soul by acting unjustly, while your soul, if you remain virtuous and don't respond with injustice in return, remains healthy. Therefore, the wrongdoer is actually in a more pitiable state than the victim. This belief would be tested to its limits when Socrates himself became a victim of injustice at his trial. Related to this was Socrates' conviction that it's never right to do wrong in return for wrong. One shouldn't harm anyone, even in retaliation for being harmed. This principle of non-retaliation was quite contrary to the Greek cultural norm of reciprocity, the idea that one should help friends and harm enemies. Socrates rejected this common view. Harming anyone for any reason was wrong because it corrupted one's own soul. The only appropriate response to being wronged was to try to educate the wrongdoer, to help them understand that they're harming themselves through their unjust actions. These ethical principles, combined with Socrates' method of questioning, formed a comprehensive approach to philosophy and life. Philosophy wasn't abstract theorizing disconnected from daily existence. It was a way of living, a daily practice of self-examination and moral improvement. Every action, every decision, every belief was subject to rational scrutiny. This was what Socrates meant by the examined life, and this was why he believed such a life was the only one worth living for a human being. For Socrates, happiness or well-being, what the Greeks called eudaimonia, could only be achieved through virtue. Wealth, health, reputation, even life itself were not truly good in themselves. They were merely resources that could be used well or badly. A healthy, wealthy person who was unjust and ignorant was actually worse off than a poor, sick person who was virtuous and wise. This was a deeply countercultural claim in a society that valued wealth, power, and physical prowess. But Socrates lived this belief, remaining cheerful and content despite his poverty, and ultimately choosing death over the compromise of his principles. The clouds of war. Athens in decline. While Socrates was developing his philosophy and gathering his circle of students, Athens was entering a period of crisis that would ultimately lead to his death. The Peloponnesian War, which began when Socrates was in his late 30s, would drag on for nearly 3 decades, pitting Athens and its allies against Sparta and its allies in a devastating conflict that would exhaust both sides and forever change the Greek world. Socrates served in this war as a hoplite, distinguishing himself through courage and endurance as mentioned earlier. But the war affected him in deeper ways than just his military service. He witnessed Athens' transformation from a confident, prosperous democracy at the height of its power to a desperate, defeated city-state, willing to compromise its values to survive. He saw how war brought out the worst in people, how it corrupted politics and morals, how it made might seem like right. The war ended disastrously for Athens in 404 BCE. The city was besieged, starved, and finally forced to surrender. The Spartan victors imposed harsh terms. Athens' walls were torn down, its navy reduced to a handful of ships, and most significantly, its democratic government was replaced by an oligarchy of 30 men who became known as the 30 Tyrants. These 30, chosen from among the Athenian aristocracy, began a reign of terror that lasted about 8 months. The 30 tyrants executed political opponents, confiscated property from wealthy citizens, and killed approximately 5% of Athens' population. It was a dark time for the city, and it had direct relevance to Socrates' later trial. 2 of the 30 were former associates of Socrates, Critias, who was the leader of the tyrants and the most brutal of them, and Charmides, Plato's uncle. Both men had spent time in Socrates' circle, listening to his philosophical discussions. Socrates' relationship with the 30 tyrants was complicated. He didn't support them or participate in their crimes. In fact, there's one documented instance of his defying them. The 30 ordered Socrates and 4 others to arrest a man named Leon of Salamis so he could be executed. While the other 4 obeyed, Socrates simply went home, refusing to participate in what he knew was an unjust act. This could have cost him his life. Only the 30's fall from power shortly afterward saved him. But Socrates also didn't actively oppose the 30 or join the democratic resistance. He remained in Athens throughout their rule, continuing his philosophical conversations. And he had, after all, associated with men like Critias before they came to power. He had questioned them, talked with them, influenced them. For many Athenians, this was enough to make Socrates suspect. If his teaching had produced men like Critias, perhaps there was something dangerous about his philosophy after all. Another student whose behavior reflected badly on Socrates was Alcibiades, one of the most controversial figures in Athenian history. Brilliant, handsome, and wealthy, Alcibiades had been a prominent politician and general. But he had also betrayed Athens during the war, defecting to Sparta and later to Persia, helping Athens' enemies. Though he later returned and was welcomed back, many Athenians blamed Socrates for Alcibiades' lack of moral character. How could someone who spent so much time with the wisest man in Athens turn out to be such a treacherous scoundrel? Socrates would later argue at his trial that he wasn't responsible for his students' actions. He had never claimed to be a teacher who could guarantee results. He merely engaged in conversations, asked questions, tried to help people think more clearly about virtue. If some who spent time with him later behaved badly, that wasn't his fault. He had never forced anyone to listen to him or follow his advice. But this defense didn't satisfy those who saw a pattern. Young men spent time with Socrates, became contemptuous of traditional values and democracy, and then either betrayed the city or tried to overthrow its government. When democracy was restored in 403 BCE, after the 30 tyrants were overthrown, there was an official amnesty for most crimes committed during that period. The city tried to move forward and heal, but resentments remained. Many Athenians wanted revenge on those who had supported the tyrants, or who seemed to threaten democratic values. And Socrates, with his known associations with Critias and Alcibiades, his constant questioning of democratic assumptions, his criticism of the idea that majority opinion determined truth or justice, became a target. It's important to understand that Socrates was critical of democracy in some fundamental ways. He believed that governing required knowledge and expertise, just like any other skill. You wouldn't let someone who knows nothing about medicine perform surgery, or let someone who can't navigate captain a ship. Why then should people who know nothing about governance be allowed to vote on important political decisions just because they happened to be citizens? This was Socrates' argument, and it cut against the basic principle of Athenian democracy, that all citizens should participate in political life. This doesn't mean Socrates favored tyranny or oligarchy. He believed in rule by those who truly knew what was best, what we might call philosopher kings, though that term comes more from Plato than from Socrates himself. But in practice, this criticism of democracy made him seem like an enemy of the system. And in a newly restored democracy that had just suffered under oligarchy, such views were dangerous. The years after the war were difficult for Athens. The city was impoverished, its empire lost, its population reduced by war and plague. There was social tension between democrats and oligarchs, between the old and young generations, between those who wanted to restore traditional values and those who embraced new ideas. In this atmosphere of fear and resentment, scapegoats were sought. And Socrates, already well known and controversial, was an obvious candidate. In the spring of 399 BCE, when Socrates was 70 years old, 3 Athenian citizens brought charges against him. The principal accuser was a man named Meletus, a young poet about whom little is known. He was joined by Anytus, a wealthy tanner who had been a democratic leader during the resistance against the 30 tyrants, and Lycon, a rhetorician. Together, they charged Socrates with 2 crimes: impiety toward the gods of the city and corrupting the youth of Athens. The indictment, as recorded by Plato, read, "Socrates is guilty of not recognizing the gods recognized by the city, and of introducing other new divinities. He is also guilty of corrupting the youth. The penalty demanded is death." These charges, though simply stated, were serious. In Athens, religious impiety and moral corruption of the young were crimes punishable by death. The trial was held before a jury of 501 Athenian citizens, selected by lot. This was typical for Athenian courts. There was no judge, no lawyers, no legal professionals at all. Ordinary citizens served as jurors, and the accused had to defend themselves. The accusers spoke first, making their case for why Socrates should be convicted. They had 3 hours to present their arguments. Then Socrates would have 3 hours to defend himself. We don't have the speeches of Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon, but we can reconstruct their arguments from Socrates' response, recorded by Plato in the dialogue called the Apology, which means defense in Greek, not an admission of guilt. The accusers likely argued that Socrates didn't participate in traditional religious observances, that he talked about a strange daimonion, or divine voice that no one else could hear, and that he questioned the traditional stories about the gods. This amounted to impiety, disrespect for the established religion. Regarding corruption of youth, the accusers probably pointed to Critias and Alcibiades as examples of what happened to young men who spent time with Socrates. They likely argued that Socrates taught young men to question their elders, to disrespect traditional authority, to think they were wiser than everyone else. This questioning attitude led to arrogance and anti-democratic behavior. The 30 tyrants had been filled with young men influenced by Socrates, the accusers claimed. When Socrates stood to defend himself, he could have offered the kind of emotional, pleading speech that often swayed Athenian juries. He could have brought his wife and children before the jury to beg for mercy. He could have promised to stop philosophizing and live quietly. But Socrates did none of these things. Instead, he gave a speech that was philosophical, defiant, and in some ways calculated to offend the very men who would decide his fate. Socrates began by addressing the long-standing prejudice against him. Going back to Aristophanes' play, The Clouds, performed decades earlier. Many jurors had grown up with that caricature of Socrates as a sophist who charged fees and taught clever rhetoric. Socrates denied these accusations. He wasn't a sophist. He didn't teach for money. He didn't claim to have expertise in anything. Then Socrates explained the oracle's pronouncement that no one was wiser than he, and how this had led him to question supposedly wise people and discover their ignorance. This was his mission, given to him by the god Apollo through the oracle. He was performing a divine service by going around Athens questioning people, trying to make them realize their ignorance and care for their souls. Far from being impious, he was following the god's command. As for corrupting the youth, Socrates argued that no one corrupts people intentionally. If he had corrupted the young men of Athens, making them worse, then they would harm him in return, since bad people harm those around them. Why would he intentionally make people who would then harm him? It made no sense. And if he had corrupted people unintentionally, then he should be educated, not punished. No one deserved death for an unintentional mistake. Furthermore, Socrates pointed out many of the young men who had spent time with him were in the courtroom, along with their fathers and brothers. If these young men had been corrupted, why weren't their families testifying against him? Instead, they were supporting him. The accusers could only point to a couple of notorious examples like Critias and Alcibiades, but there were many more who had benefited from their association with Socrates. Then Socrates turned to his daimonion. Yes, he had a divine sign that guided him, but this wasn't introducing new gods. It was simply his way of understanding how the divine communicated with him. And notably, his daimonion had never told him not to come to court today, or not to give this defense speech, which suggested that what was happening wasn't bad for him. The most powerful part of Socrates' defense was his refusal to compromise or apologize. He told the jury that he would never stop philosophizing, even if they acquitted him on condition that he cease his questioning. He had a divine mission, and he must follow it whatever the cost. "Men of Athens," he said, "I honor and love you, but I will obey the god rather than you, and as long as I breathe and am able, I will never stop practicing philosophy, examining both myself and others." He compared himself to a gadfly that the god had attached to Athens. The city was like a large, noble horse that had grown lazy and needed something to sting it awake. He was that gadfly, and if they killed him, they would spend the rest of their lives asleep, unless the god sent them another gadfly. This metaphor captured both Socrates' sense of mission and his rather condescending view of his fellow Athenians. They needed him more than he needed them. Socrates also refused to play on the jury's emotions. It was common practice for defendants to bring their families to court, to have their children weep and beg for mercy. Socrates explicitly rejected this tactic. He said it was undignified and inappropriate. The jury should judge based on justice and law, not on pity. To beg for mercy would be to admit he had done something wrong, which he had not. It would show that he valued his life more than his principles, which would contradict everything he had taught about virtue being more important than life itself. This was vintage Socrates. Principled to the point of stubbornness, willing to antagonize his judges in defense of truth, refusing to compromise his integrity for practical advantage. It was admirable in one sense, showing remarkable courage and consistency. But it was also, from a practical standpoint, rather foolish. If his goal was acquittal, this was not the way to achieve it. Many scholars believe that Socrates, at 70 years old, was not particularly trying to be He saw the trial as one final opportunity to teach, to demonstrate what the examined life looked like in practice, even in the face of death. The jury voted on guilt first. By a margin of 280 to 221, they found Socrates guilty. It was relatively close. If just 30 jurors had voted differently, he would have been acquitted. This suggests that many were uncertain, that Socrates' defense, though uncompromising, had been somewhat persuasive to a significant portion of the jury. Under Athenian law, after a guilty verdict, there would be a second vote on the penalty. The accusers proposed death. The defendant could propose an alternative penalty, and the jury would choose between the two. This was Socrates' chance to save his life. He could propose exile, or a fine, or simply a promise to stop philosophizing in public. But again, Socrates defied expectations. He began by saying that far from deserving punishment, he deserved a reward. He should be given free meals in the Prytaneum, the public dining hall where Olympic victors and other benefactors of the city were honored. After all, he had spent his life benefiting Athens, trying to improve its citizens. This was not what the jury wanted to hear from someone they'd just convicted of crimes. Eventually, probably at the urging of his friends, Socrates proposed a small fine, which he couldn't pay himself but which Plato and others offered to pay for him. The amount was trivial, an insult more than a genuine alternative to death. The jury, now probably more angry than before, voted again. This time, more voted for death than had voted for conviction in the first place. By a margin of 360 to 140, Socrates was sentenced to death by hemlock poisoning. Socrates' final words to the jury, as recorded by Plato, were prophetic and philosophical. To those who voted to convict him, he predicted that after his death, others would arise to question them, and they would face even harsher criticism than they had faced from him. Killing him wouldn't stop the questioning they found so annoying. To those who voted to acquit him, he offered comfort, saying that death might not be an evil at all. Either it was like a dreamless sleep, a peaceful oblivion, which wasn't bad, or it was a transition to another place where he could continue conversing with the great heroes and sages of the past. Either way, he said, no harm could come to a good man in this life or the next. The final days. Philosophy in the face of death. Under Athenian law, executions couldn't be carried out during certain religious festivals. As it happened, a sacred ship had just set sail for the island of Delos to honor the god Apollo, and by tradition, no executions could take place until the ship returned. This meant that Socrates had about 30 days between his sentencing and his execution. He spent this time in the Athens prison in chains, but receiving visitors and continuing to engage in philosophical conversation until the very end. His friends and students visited him daily in prison. They were devastated by the verdict and sentence. Many of them wept openly, unable to control their grief. But Socrates remained calm, even cheerful, discussing philosophy with them as if nothing unusual was happening. He comforted them rather than seeking comfort from them. This was consistent with his entire philosophy. A truly virtuous person cannot be harmed by external circumstances, not even by death. During these prison visits, Socrates engaged in some of his most profound philosophical discussions, particularly about the immortality of the soul and what might come after death. Plato's dialogue, called Phaedo, purports to be an account of Socrates' last day, and while we can't be certain how accurate it gives us a sense of how Socrates approached his death philosophically. In these conversations, Socrates argued that the soul is immortal, that it exists before the body is born and continues after the body dies. He offered several arguments for this conclusion. The soul, being the seat of life, cannot admit death, just as fire cannot admit cold, or snow cannot admit heat. The soul is more like the eternal forms, the perfect and unchanging ideas, than like the transient material body. And the knowledge we seem to have from birth, knowledge of concepts like equality and beauty that we never learned through experience, suggests that our souls existed before this life and will continue after. Whether or not these arguments are convincing, they served an important purpose in Socrates' final days. They gave his friends hope that death was not the end, that he would continue to exist in some form. And for Socrates himself, they provided a framework for understanding death not as an evil to be feared, but as a transition, perhaps even a liberation. The philosopher, after all, spent his life trying to free the soul from the body's desires and limitations. Death would accomplish this completely. But Socrates' friends weren't just grieving. Some were actively trying to save him. A wealthy friend named Crito visited him in prison with a proposal. He had bribed the guards and made arrangements for Socrates to escape. A boat was ready to take him away from Athens, to another Greek city where he would be safe. All Socrates had to do was agree to go. Crito pleaded with him, arguing that if he didn't escape, he would be abandoning his sons, he would be helping his enemies, he would be throwing away his life unnecessarily. Socrates' response to this offer, recorded in Plato's dialogue Crito, reveals the depth of his principles and his commitment to living according to his philosophy. He refused to escape, and he explained why through a careful philosophical argument. First, he said, one should never do wrong, even in response to being wronged. Escaping from prison would be wrong. It would be breaking the law, violating his agreement with the city. Socrates imagined the laws of Athens speaking to him, asking him why he would try to destroy them by disobeying. He had lived in Athens for 70 years. He had enjoyed the benefits of Athenian law and citizenship. He had implicitly agreed to obey the laws by choosing to remain in Athens rather than emigrating to another city. How could he now, when the law worked against him, choose to disobey? Wasn't that like a child striking his father because he received a punishment he didn't like? The laws continued their imaginary speech, arguing that if Socrates escaped, he would harm himself as well as Athens. Where would he go? To another Greek city? He would arrive as a fugitive, known to have broken his agreement with Athens. His philosophical teachings about virtue and justice would ring hollow. Everyone would know he valued his own life above the principles he claimed to believe. Or would he go to a foreign land, live among barbarians, and spend his old age as an exile? How would that be better than an honorable death in his own city? This argument moved the question from what will benefit me to what is right and what is consistent with my principles. For Socrates, these latter questions were more important. He had spent his entire life arguing that virtue was more valuable than life, that it was better to suffer injustice than to commit it, that one should never act wrongly even when wronged. Now, at the end of his life, he had a chance to prove he really believed what he had been teaching. Escaping would show that his philosophy was just words, that when faced with death, he valued survival over virtue. Staying and accepting his sentence, unjust though it was, would demonstrate the sincerity of his convictions. There was also a religious dimension to Socrates' refusal to escape. He believed that his daimonion, his divine sign, would have warned him if escaping were wrong. The fact that he felt no such warning suggested that accepting his fate was the right path. Perhaps the god who had given him his mission as the gadfly of Athens was now calling him to a different form of service, becoming a martyr for philosophy, showing through his death what living by principles actually meant. Crito was heartbroken but had to accept Socrates' decision. The philosopher would not be persuaded to save his own life by compromising his integrity. And so the days passed. The sacred ship sailed and returned, and the time for execution arrived. On the final day, Socrates' friends gathered in the prison. Among them was Plato, though he was ill and almost didn't come. Also present were Apollodorus, Crito, Critobulus, and many others. Conspicuously absent was Xanthippe, Socrates' wife. She had been there earlier in the day with their youngest son, but had become so distraught, crying out that this was the last time Socrates would talk with his friends, that Socrates had asked for her to be taken home. He wanted these final hours to be calm and philosophical, not overcome with emotion. As evening approached, the jailer came with a message. It was time. He praised Socrates, saying he was the noblest, gentlest, and best man who had ever come to the prison. With tears in his eyes, the jailer explained that he was only following orders, that he bore no personal ill will. Socrates thanked him kindly, showing no anger toward the man who was about to facilitate his death. The hemlock was prepared in an adjacent room. Hemlock, the poison derived from the plant Conium maculatum, was the standard method of execution in Athens. It worked by gradually paralyzing the body from the extremities inward, eventually reaching the heart and lungs. It was considered a relatively humane way to die, though the process could take some time and was not entirely painless. Before taking the poison, Socrates asked if he could pour a libation to the gods from the cup, a traditional religious gesture. The jailer explained that they only prepared exactly enough poison for the dose, no extra for pouring out. So Socrates simply offered a prayer, asking the gods to grant that his journey from this world to the next would be fortunate. Then, calmly and without hesitation, he raised the cup to his lips and drank it all in one draught. His friends, who had been holding back their grief during the philosophical discussions, now broke down completely. They wept and lamented, not for Socrates' sake, as he was calm and composed, but for their own. They were losing a friend, a teacher, a guide. Socrates gently chided them, saying this was not the way to behave. He had sent the women away so that the scene wouldn't be disturbed by such outbursts. They should be calm and brave. The jailer instructed Socrates to walk around until his legs felt heavy, then to lie down. The poison would do the rest. So Socrates walked around the cell for a while, conversing with his friends. Eventually, he said his legs were getting heavy, and he lay down on his back. The jailer checked his feet and legs, pressing them and asking if Socrates could feel it. Gradually, the sensation left his feet, then his legs, moving upward. As the paralysis spread through his body, Socrates remained conscious and spoke with his friends. The account in Plato's Phaedo is poignant. Socrates covered his face with a cloth, but then he uncovered it one last time and spoke his final words. He said, "Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Make sure to pay the debt." Asclepius was the god of healing, and it was customary to sacrifice a rooster to him after recovering from an illness. Socrates' meaning was clear. Death was not a misfortune but a healing, a release from the illness of embodied life. It was a final philosophical statement, transforming death into something positive. Crito promised to pay the debt and asked if there was anything else Socrates wanted to say. But there was no answer. A few moments later, the man attending Socrates uncovered his face and saw that his eyes were fixed. Crito closed his mouth and eyes. Socrates was dead. According to Plato, who recorded this scene, Socrates died peacefully and calmly, accepting his fate with equanimity and grace. He had lived according to his principles, and he died according to them as well. His death was not a tragedy but a triumph, the ultimate demonstration of what living the examined life meant. Legacy: the death that created philosophy. The death of Socrates in 399 BCE was not the end of his influence but the beginning. In some ways, his death was more powerful than his life in establishing his legacy. By choosing to die rather than compromise his principles, by remaining calm and philosophical until his last breath, Socrates became a symbol of intellectual integrity and moral courage that would inspire thinkers for millennia to come. His most immediate impact was on his students, particularly Plato. The shock and grief of Socrates' death drove Plato to preserve his teacher's memory and methods through his writings. Over the course of his long life, Plato wrote more than 30 dialogues, most featuring Socrates as the main character. These dialogues became the foundation of Western philosophy and ensured that Socrates' ideas and methods would never be forgotten. In Plato's early dialogues, scholars generally believe we get a fairly accurate portrait of the historical Socrates. His method of questioning, his ironic claims of ignorance, his focus on ethical questions, his refusal to provide definitive answers. But in later dialogues, Plato began using Socrates as a mouthpiece for his own increasingly elaborate philosophical theories about the nature of reality, knowledge, and the ideal state. The historical Socrates and Plato's literary Socrates began to diverge. This creates what scholars call the Socratic problem. How do we distinguish the real Socrates from Plato's version of him? We have other sources, particularly Xenophon, another student who wrote about Socrates. But Xenophon's Socrates is quite different from Plato's, more practical and conventional, less philosophically sophisticated. Which version is more accurate? Or are they both partial portraits of a complex individual who meant different things to different people? Ultimately, we can never fully solve this problem. The historical Socrates will always remain somewhat mysterious, known to us only through others' accounts that were written with their own purposes and biases. But perhaps this is appropriate. Socrates chose not to write anything himself, believing that philosophy happened in live dialogue, not on the page. The fact that he left no writings means that each generation must reconstruct him anew, must engage with the questions he raised rather than simply memorizing his answers. What is clear is that Socrates had an extraordinary impact on the development of philosophy. Before Socrates, Greek philosophy had focused primarily on understanding nature and the cosmos. Thinkers like Thales, Heraclitus, and Democritus asked questions about what the world was made of, how it worked, what fundamental principles governed reality. Socrates shifted philosophy's focus to human concerns: ethics, politics, knowledge, virtue. He made philosophy personal and practical, about how to live rather than just what to think. The Socratic method of questioning became a model for philosophical inquiry that persists to this day. In law schools around the world, professors use Socratic questioning to teach students to think critically about legal principles. In psychotherapy, Socratic questioning helps clients examine their beliefs and assumptions. In education generally, good teachers use Socratic dialogue to help students discover understanding for themselves rather than simply receiving information passively. Every major philosophical school that emerged after Socrates claimed him as an inspiration or predecessor. The Cynics, founded by Antisthenes, took Socrates' contempt for material wealth and conventional values to an extreme, living in complete simplicity and rejecting social norms. The Cyrenaics, founded by Aristippus, emphasized the pursuit of pleasure, seeing Socrates' focus on the examined life as ultimately about achieving happiness. The Stoics, influenced by Socrates through Xenophon's writings, made virtue the sole good and developed elaborate techniques for maintaining equanimity in the face of fortune's changes. And of course, Plato's Academy, founded in Athens after Socrates' death, became the center of Western philosophical thought for nearly 1,000 years. Through Plato's student Aristotle, and through the Christian appropriation of Platonic philosophy, Socratic ideas filtered down through Western intellectual history, shaping how we think about knowledge, virtue, education, and the examined life. The image of Socrates dying for his principles became one of the most powerful symbols in Western culture. For early Christians, Socrates became a kind of proto-Christian, a pagan saint who died for truth and virtue. Erasmus, the great Renaissance humanist, was known to pray Saint Socrates, "Pray for us," seeing in the ancient philosopher a model of Christian virtue despite his paganism. Enlightenment thinkers in the 18th century celebrated Socrates as a champion of reason against superstition, of free inquiry against dogma. In the modern world, Socrates remains relevant in multiple ways. His insistence on questioning authority and examining beliefs speaks to democratic values and critical thinking. His belief that the unexamined life is not worth living resonates with contemporary emphasis on self-awareness and authenticity. His method of dialogue and questioning provides a model for education and inquiry that avoids both authoritarian instruction and relativistic acceptance of all opinions. But perhaps Socrates' deepest legacy is the very concept of philosophy itself as he practiced it. Before Socrates, wise men might have special knowledge about the gods or nature, but philosophy wasn't seen as a lifelong practice open to everyone. Socrates democratized philosophy by showing that anyone who was willing to think critically and examine their beliefs could engage in philosophical inquiry. You didn't need special training or mystical insights. You needed only honesty, courage, and a willingness to follow the argument wherever it led. At the same time, Socrates set a high standard for what philosophical life meant. It wasn't just abstract theorizing or clever argumentation. It was a way of living, a commitment to virtue and truth that governed every aspect of one's existence. The philosopher was someone who valued wisdom above wealth, virtue above pleasure, integrity above life itself. Few could meet this standard fully, but Socrates showed it was possible and demonstrated what it looked like in practice. The questions Socrates raised remain as urgent today as they were in ancient Athens. What is justice? What is virtue? How should we live? What do we really know and what do we only think we know? What is the relationship between knowledge and goodness? These fundamental questions about human existence don't have simple or final answers, which is precisely why they remain philosophical questions, worthy of continued examination and dialogue. In contemplating Socrates' life and death, we are confronted with profound choices about our own lives. Will we examine our beliefs and assumptions, or will we live unthinkingly, accepting whatever we're told? Will we have the courage to follow truth and virtue even when it costs us something? Or will we compromise our principles for comfort and safety? Will we care for our souls, cultivating wisdom and virtue? Or will we focus primarily on our bodies and possessions? These are not easy questions, and Socrates didn't make following his example look easy. He lived in poverty, was often mocked and resented, and ultimately was executed by his own city. Yet, by most accounts, he was remarkably happy and fulfilled. He had lived according to his principles, had engaged in work he found meaningful, had helped others think more clearly about their lives. And when death came, he faced it without fear, consistent to the end with his philosophical convictions. The barefoot philosopher of ancient Athens, walking through the agora asking questions, may seem very distant from our modern world. But the fundamental human concerns he addressed are timeless. We still struggle with questions of right and wrong, still wonder what makes a life meaningful, still must choose between comfort and principle, still need to understand ourselves better. In this sense, Socrates remains our contemporary, and his examined life remains a challenge and inspiration. His death, rather than silencing his voice, amplified it. Because he was willing to die for his beliefs, those beliefs gained authority and power they might not have had otherwise. If he had recanted or escaped or begged for mercy, his philosophy would have seemed merely theoretical, untested by real consequence. But by accepting death rather than compromise, Socrates proved that he truly believed what he taught. His death gave weight to his life's work and ensured that his ideas would be taken seriously by future generations. Plato wrote that those present at Socrates' death felt they had witnessed the passing of the wisest and most just and best man of all whom we have known in our time. This was high praise from devoted students, but it wasn't mere sentiment. Socrates had demonstrated through his life and death what wisdom, justice, and goodness looked like in practice. He had shown that it was possible to live by principles, to maintain integrity even under pressure, to value virtue above everything else, including life itself. The centuries since Socrates' death have seen countless philosophical systems come and go, elaborate theories rise and fall. But the simple Socratic question remains: how should I live? And the simple Socratic answer remains challenging. The examined life, the life of virtue guided by wisdom, is the only life worth living for a human being. Everything else, wealth and pleasure and honor, and even life itself, is secondary to this fundamental task of caring for one's soul. Socrates' influence extends far beyond professional philosophy. His method has shaped education, law, psychology, and countless other fields. His emphasis on critical thinking and self-examination has become foundational to Western intellectual culture. His example of living according to one's principles, even unto death, has inspired countless people facing moral dilemmas and difficult choices. From political dissidents standing up to tyranny to ordinary people trying to live with integrity in their daily lives, Socrates' example resonates. The Socratic dialogue, that simple back and forth of question and answer, has proven to be one of the most powerful tools for uncovering truth and testing beliefs. It's used in courtrooms to cross-examine witnesses, in therapy sessions to help clients understand themselves, in classrooms to help students think deeply, in business meetings to solve problems, and in personal reflection to examine one's own beliefs and values. The power of the method lies in its simplicity and its focus on reason and evidence rather than authority or emotion. Socrates also taught us about the value of admitting ignorance. In a world where people are often rewarded for appearing confident and knowledgeable, where admitting you don't know something can seem like weakness, Socrates reminds us that true wisdom begins with recognizing the limits of our knowledge. The person who says, "I don't know," and then seeks to find out is wiser than the person who pretends to know what they don't actually understand. This intellectual humility is perhaps more important today than ever. We live in an age of information overload, where everyone has access to vast amounts of data, but wisdom remains elusive. We're surrounded by people who speak with great confidence about complex issues they barely understand. The Socratic reminder to question our assumptions, to test our beliefs, to remain open to being wrong, is desperately needed in our polarized and certain world. Socrates also teaches us about the relationship between how we think and how we live. He believed that examining our lives wasn't just an intellectual exercise, but had direct moral consequences. When we think more clearly about virtue, when we understand ourselves better, when we recognize contradictions in our beliefs, we become better people. Philosophy isn't separate from life. It's a way of living more consciously, more virtuously, more authentically. The trial and death of Socrates raises profound questions about the relationship between the individual and society, between conscience and law, between truth and power. Socrates was executed legally by a democratic vote of his fellow citizens. The system worked as it was designed to work, yet the result was a grave injustice. This paradox has challenged thinkers for centuries. When is it right to disobey the law? When should individual conscience override social norms? How do we balance respect for democratic institutions with the need to stand up for truth and justice? Socrates' answer, revealed in his refusal to escape from prison, was complex. He would not disobey the law, even when that law worked unjustly against him. He had agreed to live under Athenian law by choosing to remain in Athens for 70 years. He couldn't now selectively obey only when it suited him. Yet he also would not stop philosophizing, even if the law commanded him to do so. He would obey the god's command to examine life rather than any human law telling him to stop. This tension between civic obedience and moral autonomy remains unresolved, a challenge for every generation. The story of Socrates also reminds us of the danger of anti-intellectualism and the persecution of those who think differently. Athens, the birthplace of democracy and philosophy, executed its greatest philosopher for asking questions. This wasn't an isolated incident in human history. Throughout the ages, thinkers who challenged conventional wisdom, who asked uncomfortable questions, who made people examine their assumptions, have been silenced, persecuted, or killed. Socrates' death stands as a warning about what happens when a society becomes intolerant of questioning and critical thought. Yet Socrates' death also demonstrates the ultimate futility of trying to suppress ideas through force. By killing Socrates, Athens didn't silence his philosophy, it immortalized it. His ideas spread more widely after his death than they might have during his lifetime. His students, especially Plato, made sure his method and insights were preserved for future generations. The martyr often has more influence than the living activist. Truth, as the saying goes, crushed to earth, will rise again. For those of us listening to this story today, what can we take from Socrates' example? We can commit to living more examined lives, to questioning our assumptions rather than accepting them blindly. We can practice intellectual humility, recognizing that we probably don't know as much as we think we do. We can engage in genuine dialogue with others, seeking truth rather than just trying to win arguments. We can care for our souls, our inner lives, as much as or more than we care for our bodies and possessions. We can also practice moral courage, standing up for what we believe is right even when it's difficult or costly. We don't need to face death like Socrates did, but we face smaller tests of integrity regularly. Will we speak the truth when lying would be easier? Will we admit mistakes when denying them would protect our ego? Will we defend someone being treated unfairly when silence would be safer? These everyday choices are our opportunities to live Socratically, to value virtue over comfort. The examined life that Socrates advocated is not a destination but a journey. We never finish examining our lives. There's always more to understand about ourselves and the world. Every day brings new experiences that challenge our beliefs, new information that might change our minds, new opportunities to act virtuously or fail to do so. The commitment to examination must be ongoing, a daily practice rather than a one-time event. Socrates believed that this examined life was not just worthwhile, but essential to being fully human. Animals live by instinct. Humans can live by reason and reflection. To fail to use this capacity, to live unreflectively like animals, is to waste our human potential. We have the ability to think about our thinking, to question our desires, to imagine being different than we are. This capacity for self-reflection is what makes us human, and using it well is what makes us good humans. The philosophical legacy of Socrates continues to evolve. Each generation finds new relevance in his ideas, new applications for his method, new inspiration in his example. In our digital age, with its social media echo chambers and algorithmic certainty, the Socratic emphasis on dialogue and questioning assumptions is more needed than ever. In our consumerist culture, with its focus on material success and external validation, the Socratic focus on caring for the soul resonates with those seeking deeper meaning. In our politically polarized world, the Socratic commitment to following the argument wherever it leads, regardless of whether the conclusion supports our preferred views, offers a path toward genuine understanding. Socrates never wrote a book, never founded a school with his name on it, never accumulated wealth or power. He just walked around Athens asking questions, trying to help people think more clearly about virtue and the good life. And that simple act, carried out with integrity and courage for decades, changed the world more profoundly than most armies or empires ever have. It shows the power of ideas, the importance of individual conscience, and the enduring value of the examined life. As we come to the end of this journey through the life of Socrates, we're left not with answers, but with questions. And perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Socrates would want us to question, to examine, to think for ourselves rather than simply accepting what we're told. He would want us to continue the conversation he started 2,500 years ago in the Athenian Agora, a conversation about how to live well, how to know truly, how to be virtuous and wise. Conclusion: the eternal questions. As we come to the end of this journey through ancient Athens and the life of Socrates, let's take a moment to reflect on what this remarkable man has to teach us, even across the vast distance of 2.5 millennia. His story is not just a historical curiosity, but a living challenge to how we think and live today. Socrates never wrote a book, never founded a school, never held political office, never accumulated wealth. By conventional measures, he was a failure. He died in poverty, executed by his own city as a criminal. Yet his influence on human thought and Western civilization is immeasurable. He changed philosophy from a specialized pursuit of a few intellectuals to a way of life accessible to anyone willing to think critically and examine their beliefs. The questions he asked in the Athenian marketplace continue to echo through classrooms, courtrooms, therapists' offices, and our own minds when we pause to reflect on our lives. What do I really know? What do I merely think I know? What is truly valuable? What makes a life worth living? Am I living according to my principles, or am I fooling myself? These Socratic questions never lose their relevance because they address the fundamental challenge of being human. Perhaps the most important lesson from Socrates is that wisdom begins with recognizing our own ignorance. In a world where everyone has opinions about everything, where confidence often masquerades as knowledge, where admitting uncertainty can seem like weakness, Socrates reminds us of the value of intellectual humility. The wisest person is not the one who claims to know everything, but the one who understands the limits of their knowledge and remains open to learning. The examined life that Socrates advocated is not easy or comfortable. It requires questioning things we take for granted, challenging beliefs we've held since childhood, recognizing uncomfortable truths about ourselves. It's much easier to live unreflectively, following convention, accepting what we're told, never asking why. But as Socrates insisted, such a life is not worthy of a human being. We have the capacity for reason and self-reflection. Failing to use these capacities is failing to live fully as humans. Socrates also teaches us about moral courage. It's one thing to talk about principles and values. It's another to live by them when doing so costs us something. Socrates showed through his life, and especially his death, that integrity means consistency between words and actions, between professed beliefs and actual choices. He could have saved his life by compromising, by apologizing, by promising to stop philosophizing. He chose death instead because his principles mattered more to him than his life. Most of us will never face such an extreme choice, but we face smaller choices every day where integrity is at stake. Do we speak up for what we believe is right when doing so might make us unpopular? Do we admit mistakes and ignorance when doing so might make us look weak? Do we question our own beliefs when new evidence challenges them? In these everyday moments, we have opportunities to practice the Socratic virtue of caring more for truth than for reputation, more for wisdom than for comfort. The legacy of Socrates reminds us that one person, living with integrity and dedication to truth, can change the world. He had no wealth, no political power, no armies, no institutions behind him. He just had his questions, his method, his conviction that examined life was worth living, and his willingness to die for these beliefs. That was enough to establish the foundation of Western philosophy and to inspire countless people across the centuries. As you lie here now, perhaps drifting toward sleep, consider the life of this remarkable man who walked barefoot through ancient Athens asking questions. Consider how his story might apply to your own life. Are there beliefs you hold that you've never really examined? Are there questions you've been avoiding because the answers might be uncomfortable? Is there a gap between the principles you profess and how you actually live? You don't need to become a philosopher or live in poverty or face martyrdom to benefit from Socrates' example. You simply need to commit to thinking more carefully about your life, to questioning your assumptions, to valuing wisdom and virtue, to maintaining integrity between your beliefs and your actions. You need to care for your soul the way Socrates did, recognizing that this inner life is more important than external circumstances. The unexamined life is not worth living, Socrates said. But he also showed that the examined life, though challenging, is deeply rewarding. It's a life of honesty with oneself, of continuous growth and learning, of authentic values rather than conventional opinions. It's a life that cannot be taken away by external forces because its value lies within, in the quality of one's thinking and character. As the story of Socrates comes to a close, his final words echo across the centuries. We owe a rooster to Asclepius. Death as healing, as release, as transition to something new. Whether or not you believe in an afterlife, there's profound wisdom in seeing endings not as tragedies but as natural transitions. Socrates faced death without fears because he had lived well, had remained true to his principles, had cared for his soul. He had nothing to regret and nothing to fear. So let the example of Socrates, the barefoot philosopher of Athens, inspire you to live more thoughtfully, more courageously, more authentically. Let his questions become your questions. Let his examined life challenge you to examine your own. And let his peaceful death remind you that living well means living by your principles, whatever the cost. In ancient Athens, one man asked questions that changed the world. His name was Socrates, and though he has been dead for nearly 2,500 years, his voice still calls to us across the centuries. Know thyself, examine your life, care for your soul, live well. These simple imperatives remain as vital today as they were in the 5th century before the Common Era. And they will remain vital as long as humans exist to ponder the mystery of their own existence. Rest well, knowing that the questions Socrates asked will be there tomorrow, waiting to be explored anew. The examined life is a journey, not a destination, and every day offers fresh opportunities to think more clearly, live more virtuously, and understand ourselves more deeply. The gadfly of Athens would be pleased to know that his sting is still felt, that his questions still provoke, that his example still inspires. Sleep now, and dream perhaps of marble columns gleaming in Mediterranean sunlight, of conversations in ancient marketplaces, of a short man with bulging eyes and a penetrating gaze, asking with genuine curiosity, "But what do you mean by that? Can you explain it more clearly? Have you really thought this through?" And in the morning, you might wake with those questions on your mind, ready to examine your own life a little more carefully, to think a little more deeply, to live a little more consciously. The philosopher who drank the hemlock rather than betray his principles left us with more than just philosophical ideas. He left us with an example of how to live with integrity, how to face death with courage, and how to remain true to oneself even when the whole world seems to be against you. He showed us that ideas matter, that truth is worth pursuing, that virtue is more valuable than life itself. And, perhaps most importantly, Socrates showed us that we don't need to have all the answers to live a meaningful life. In fact, recognizing that we don't have all the answers, remaining open to questioning and dialogue, continuing to examine our beliefs and assumptions throughout our lives. This is itself a form of wisdom. The person who thinks they have everything figured out has stopped growing, stopped learning, stopped truly living. The person who, like Socrates, admits their ignorance and continues to question is on the path to genuine understanding. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life and philosophy of Socrates. If you enjoyed this exploration of ancient wisdom and its modern relevance, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us create more content, exploring the great thinkers and ideas that have shaped our world. Share this video with someone who might benefit from Socrates' timeless wisdom about living an examined life. Leave a comment below telling us what aspect of Socrates' philosophy resonates most with you, or what questions his story raises in your own mind. The conversation that Socrates started 2,500 years ago continues, and you are part of it. Until next time, keep questioning, keep examining, and keep caring for your soul. Remember that wisdom begins with recognizing what you don't know, that virtue is more valuable than any external good, and that the examined life is the only life truly worth living. Good night, sleep well, and may you wake tomorrow ready to ask better questions, seek deeper truths, and live more consciously. The barefoot philosopher walks no more through the streets of Athens, but his questions walk through our minds. His example lives in our choices, and his voice speaks whenever we pause to ask ourselves, "How should I live?" May we have the courage to answer honestly, and the integrity to live by what we discover. Good night.